It's been quite an experience this week for those of us who rely on the more fact-based mainstream outlets for our news coverage. After a Trump rally, even more unusual than most, led us all down a conspiracy theory wormhole. You may have seen the signs at Tuesday night's event, "We Are Q," and referring to QAnon. What is QAnon, many asked? Well, sit back and get ready for a wild ride. According to the Washington Post, QAnon, quote, is an anonymous internet user claiming to be a government agent with top security clearance, waging war against the so-called deep state in service to Trump. And whoever it or they are, they have a whole lot of followers. Among them, Roseanne Barr and former Red Sox pitcher turned pundit Curt Schilling. Q first started posting on internet message boards in October of last year, posing questions or what followers called breadcrumbs, and theories like this one you may recall, that the Parkland shooting was, quote, organized and designed to distract, and actors are acting. So, what does the president think of these kinds of conspiracy followers showing up at his rallies?
The president condemns and denounces any group that would incite violence against another individual, and certainly doesn't support groups that would promote that type of behavior.
So does that include QAnon, or doesn't it? Of course, it's not a huge surprise that the Trump administration isn't willing to denounce a group of conspiracy theorists just yet, given his own history with Barack Obama.
If he wasn't born in this country, which is a real possibility, then he has pulled one of the great cons in the history of politics.
And then there were these musings on vaccines.
The child, a beautiful child, went to have the vaccine and came back and a week later got a tremendous fever, got very, very sick, now is autistic.
And how about this theory that Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia was murdered?
It's a horrible topic, but they say they found a pillow on his face, which is a pretty unusual place to find a pillow.
Okay, then. So is this mountain of conspiracy theories just an odd sideshow or something to be seriously reckoned with? Joining me here, Tom Whalen. He's an associate professor of social science and American history at Boston University. Good to see you, Tom. Okay. Michael Serazio, assistant professor of communication at Boston College. Mike, good to meet you. And Gautam Mukunda, a Harvard Kennedy School fellow and author of Indispensable When Leaders Really Matter. Gautam, it's good to see you, too. So, Mr. History, let's start with you first. Are we a nation prone to conspiracy obsession through the years?
I think that's a fair thing to say, really, since our nation's founding. Here in Boston, the Sons of Liberty, you know, the British Parliament is trying to strip us of our liberty, make us into slaves, and that set off the Boston Tea Party and the American Revolution.
How about a couple of other examples through the years?
Well, think of the Know-Nothing Party in the 1850s, which became a major party, and they were responding to the immigration wave of Irish and Germans coming to this country. Particularly working-class whites, Protestants, were afraid that they were going to lose their jobs to these newcomers.
Mike, what draws people to these kinds of things, particularly when a normal, rational person knows that much of what is being said is clearly and undeniably untrue? Why are they drawn in?
Well, I don't think rationality is the basis upon which they're evaluating the facts that they sort of weave into this tapestry of conspiracy. In many ways, people are, creatures in search of meaning, and at a moment in time where things can seem random and chaotic in the news, these conspiracies offer a way to sort of give order and clarity to what might otherwise seem random and meaningless.
Do they know that what they're buying into is not true? Does it not matter? What is it?
Well, I think that the challenge is being able to sort of burst through that sort of filter of being able to know whether it's true or not. And I'm not sure ultimately if that's what they want to believe, then whether or not they know that it's true might not matter as much.
You know, in following up on that notion, Gautam, not only is it interesting to me how they get lured in, or not lured in, or why they choose to go in, but why they choose not to go out. I mean, for example, Alex Jones, who's a big-time QAnon kind of guy, said the Democrats were going to lead initiate a civil war on July 4th. As far as I knew, I read the papers that day, it didn't happen, but it appears to have affected none of them.
Well, the fireworks were pretty impressive. But so I think the best way to think about this is to look at cults. And if you look at sort of apocalyptic cults that are led by people who announce that the world will end on May 15th, and then May 15th rolls around and it doesn't. The interesting thing is what happens to the leader and the cult afterwards, right?
What does happen?
So the surprising thing is nothing. If I were in that cult, I'd think, I would want to kill this guy. But actually, it turns out that what you come up with is elaborate explanations for why, in fact, this person was still correct, and it was just put off by a few weeks. And this is a pretty standard thing. It happens all. This is why fraternity initiations are so bad. This is why Marine boot camp is so unpleasant. If you create these sort of upfront costs to joining something, it creates a psychological pressure that, gee, this thing must be awesome that I paid these costs, I'm worth it. And so the very fact that we look at QAnon and say, you are a crazy person for believing this, actually makes it harder for people who believe in it to leave, because then they would have to admit that they have been a crazy person for so long, and very few people are able to make that leap.
By the way, if this is all new to you at home, which it was to me a few days ago, this is not amateur hour by a long shot. Here's a piece of a video called The Story of the Plan, just tweeted out a couple of days ago by that very same Kurt Schilling. Here it is.
Have you ever wondered why we go to war? Or why you never seem to be able to get out of debt? Why there is poverty, division, and crime? What if I told you there was a reason for it all? What if I told you it was done on purpose?
I thought this was a tiny but loud fringe element until the Tampa rally. And then all of a sudden, when they sort of had their coming out party, at least I hadn't seen them out in public. We all saw the T-shirts. I think it was Tuesday night. I'm QAnon. We are QAnon. T-shirts just with a Q on it. Did that change things? Was that a major moment in this,
I think
movement,
it's all,
for lack of a better expression?
I think you have to realize that it's driven by changes in communications technology. Why do we know so much about the Kennedy assassination? Why are so many people doubting it? Well, in the early 1960s, that's when television replaced the printed word. And people were getting information in new ways that not necessarily were the most accurate ways. Where are we now? Well, we're living in an age of social media, of Twitter, and all sorts of websites which can traffic in anything, and there's no editors in place to say whether it's true or not. Newspapers are dying. And I think technology has kind of undermined and questioned the whole idea of what is truth.
I'm sorry, Mike, what?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that that's an excellent point, and I think that the sort of key word to contextualize this is fragmentation, right? Conspiracy theories can fester, can grow in spaces where media fragmentation makes them fertile.
Before you I want to add one thing to this discussion. The thing to me is not whether this is an interesting academic discussion, but whether there's a threat that is part of this whole thing. Chuck Todd from Meet the Press was on the radio with us today, and we're talking about two things. One, the threats directed at the media, the enemy of the people, and this whole conspiracy thing. Here's what Chuck had to say.
One of these primetime rallies, we saw somebody get taken out on a stretcher or taken out by an ambulance. It feels like that a member of the press this is going to happen to them. And don't think, we're all worried about this. Every single major news organization worth their salt has now had to hire more security. It's certainly not what I thought came with the job.
Yeah, and this is not an abstract fear from my perspective. You all read about the thing at the Hoover Dam recently where a guy comes in an armored car. Virtually everybody in the studio, we were in Washington for Inauguration Week. We went to Comet Ping Pong Pizza in Washington. That was the place where some guy, Edgar Walsh, I think his name was Edgar Welch, from one of the Carolinas, hears that there is a child sex ring in the basement led by Hillary Clinton and her campaign chair. He came with an AR-15, shot the thing, and luckily didn't hurt anybody.
So this is absolutely a real threat. So the first thing is, it is very important to emphasize that these are actually very small groups of people. They're not very large. And one reason it's important to emphasize that is because the perception that they are large actually draws adherence to them. As with the vaccine denial, and we need to emphasize that, no, this is a tiny fringe of people who do not understand the world to believe this. There are not many of them. But if you study sort of the radicalization in terrorist groups in Iraq or in Afghanistan, things like that, what you see is that the videos and the patterns of self-radicalization that we see with these movements are identical. They look extraordinarily similar. And so I would, every time I look at this stuff, I say, if you flip this and made it an ISIS video, it wouldn't look that different. And we should be really, really scared about this stuff. And it's particularly so in the sense that if I told you that the campaign manager of the President of the United States was conspiring with a was paid off by a foreign intelligence agency who was also met with the son of the President of the United States, you would say that's a crazy conspiracy theory, except they've actually admitted that happened, right? So we live in a time in which even the most implausible conspiracy theories actually look at them and say, well, no, that's the lead on the evening news.
Do you agree with the notion that there's a threat here? I mean, we're obsessed with the hacking. Should we be obsessed with this conspiracy stuff?
I think
Quickly, if you can.
I think it's obviously of concern. I think historically we've tended to think about the threat to journalists and reporters happening outside the U.S., right? If you're reporting on the drug war in Mexico or if you're reporting on events in the Middle East. But I think clearly the rhetoric indicates that there is some degree of fear that we should be felt.
It was pretty tense at that rally with Jim Acosta from CNN. People giving him the fingers, screaming at him, CNN sucks, all this kind of thing. Do you agree?
I think so. I mean, there's a sociological term called the Thomas theorem. If you believe something to be true, it has real-life consequences. 1834, over in Charlestown, a Catholic convent was burned to the ground by an angry Protestant mob because the rumor out there was that the nuns were doing insidious things to people within the convent.
So you only need one person on the edge to believe it to make the threat real.
Well, I think you have to look the broader sense. Underneath the surface, there was a lot of anti-immigrant feeling taking place, and that's really kind of where we are right now. And there's economic uncertainty due to globalization.
We got to go. Tom, thanks so much.
Thanks,
good
Jim.
to see you. Mike, good to meet you.
Thank you very much.
Gautam, as always.
Thanks, Jim.
Really appreciate it. Thanks so much.